Okay, everyone, this is Mr. Schwartz again, and we right now are going to be learning about operant conditioning, which is another type of behavioral modification, otherwise known as learning, that's different from classical conditioning. Operant conditioning means that we are attempting to increase or decrease behavior through the use of reinforcement or punishment. Reinforcement increases behavior, punishment decreases behavior. Remember that. How do we differentiate operant conditioning from classical conditioning? In classical conditioning, learning is done through association. Two items that wouldn't normally be paired become paired, and the organism's behavior changes in response to the pairing of those two items. In operant conditioning, an organism learns a behavior through reward or punishment. Probably the most common example of operant conditioning is if you've ever had a dog and you have to train your dog. You're using operant conditioning in order to train your dog. The person often associated with development, or at least the origin of this model of learning, is a guy by the name of Edward Thorndike, who was an American psychologist. He developed the law of effect, basically doing experiments on his cats and determining how long it would take the cats to figure out how to escape from a box, and using fish as a reward. So in this case, the fish became the reinforcement, the reward that increased the cat's behavior. The law of effect, associated with Thorndike. Behavior that is followed by a pleasant consequence is likely to be repeated, and behavior that is followed by an unpleasant consequence is likely to be stopped. That seems pretty self-explanatory on the surface. A pleasant consequence would be a reinforcement. An unpleasant consequence is a punishment. Understand, in both instances, there is an effect, there is a consequence. Whether the consequence is positive or negative determines whether or not well, I shouldn't say positive or negative. I should say pleasant or unpleasant, because we'll see in the next couple slides how positive and negative are used in talking about operant conditioning and in talking about reinforcement. So, a pleasant consequence is likely to increase behavior, and an unpleasant consequence is likely to decrease behavior. Here's why we can't use positive and negative to mean good or bad. When we're talking about reinforcement, when we're talking about operant conditioning, positive and negative don't mean good and bad, respectively. Positive and negative mean something is being added or something is being subtracted. Okay? So regardless of whether we're talking about reinforcement or punishment, if we're talking about positive, we're talking about something being added. If we're talking about negative, something is being removed. So, again, whether it's positive or negative reinforcement, if it is intended to increase behavior, it is reinforcement. Positive doesn't mean good, and negative doesn't mean bad. Positive means adding a stimulus. Negative means removing an unwanted stimulus in order to increase behavior. Positive reinforcement, I think, is generally more easily understood. You get an A on your test, you're more likely to study for the next time. Your dog sits on command, you give the dog a treat, the dog is more likely to sit next time in order to get a treat. Negative reinforcement's a little trickier because, again, we're talking about the removal of an unwanted stimulus in order to increase behavior. To avoid getting a sunburn, you increase the behavior of applying sunscreen when you go to the beach. My favorite example of negative reinforcement is the ding that goes off repeatedly when you're driving in your car and you don't put your seatbelt on. Modern safety features in cars have the cell phone warning that if you don't put a seatbelt warning that if you don't put your seatbelt on after a minute, your car will start making this annoying repetitive dinging sound. How do you make that dinging sound go away? You fasten your seatbelt. So, the removal of the adverse stimulus is making that annoying dinging sound go away. How do you do that? Well, you increase the behavior of fastening your seatbelt. The next time you get into your car, you're more likely to put your seatbelt on in order to avoid the adverse stimulus of that annoying ding. So, you fasten your seatbelt in order to get rid of the annoying sound. That's negative reinforcement. The removal of an adverse stimulus increases a targeted behavior. Punishment, anything that decreases behavior. Punishment, too, can be positive or negative. Again, not meaning good or bad, meaning something being added versus something being subtracted or taken away. Positive punishment, something is given to you. You get a ticket for violating traffic laws, likely to decrease the behavior of speeding in the future. Or negative punishment, something is being taken away. You lose your car keys or if you're caught drunk driving, they'll suspend your license. Something is taken away from you. In Mr. Demo's class, you get your cell phone taken away from you if you're on your phone in class. That's an example of negative punishment. Something is being taken away. And again, punishment is intended always to decrease a behavior. So your cell phone being taken away is intended to decrease the likelihood that you're going to be on your phone the next time you're in Mr. Demo's class. Okay? So remember, reinforcement, increasing behavior, punishment, decreasing behavior. Positive, something is being added to the situation to either increase behavior or decrease behavior, depending if we're talking about reinforcement or punishment. Negative, meaning something is being taken away from the situation in order to increase behavior if it's negative reinforcement, or decrease behavior if it's negative punishment. Negative reinforcement does not mean punishment. People who don't know, people who are not educated in psychology, people who have not taken this class will often refer to positive punishment as negative reinforcement. They will often say, you shouldn't yell at people because you don't want to give them negative reinforcement. Yelling at somebody is not an example of reinforcement. It's an example of punishment, if the idea is to get them to decrease their behavior. Yelling at someone could be an example of reinforcement if you're attempting to motivate and encourage them, but that's a different situation. Negative reinforcement is intended to increase behavior by removing an adverse stimulus. Punishment, whether it's positive or negative, is always intended to decrease behavior. Negative reinforcement is not the same as punishment. Remember that, because I'm going to ask you to explain the difference between negative reinforcement and punishment. Let's take a look at some examples and see if you can't figure out what type of operant conditioning this is. You go fishing, and after 3 hours, you catch a fish. Is catching a fish more likely to increase your fishing behavior in the future, or is it likely to decrease the fishing behavior in the future? That's the first question, because that'll tell you whether or not we're looking at reinforcement or punishment. Okay, so most likely, if you catch a fish, you're more likely to go fishing in the future. I don't like fishing, but that's not the point. Now, we've decided that this is an example of reinforcement. Is it positive reinforcement or is it negative reinforcement? Well, is something being added or is something being removed? Well, the fish is being added to the situation, which means this is an example of positive reinforcement. because you are more likely to go fishing again in the future. You're being yelled at by your coach after you fumbled. Okay? Now, we can look at this a number of different ways. What is the behavior that's being increased or decreased? Well, let's look at it on the surface. The coach, by yelling at you, is attempting to decrease the behavior of fumbling. So, the coach is providing positive punishment. He is yelling. He is adding the stimulus of yelling in order to decrease the behavior of fumbling. Okay? Now, we could look at this in another way. We could look at this as an example of negative reinforcement. If you don't want to be yelled at by your coach, hang on to the ball. That would be an example of negative reinforcement because we're attempting to increase the behavior of holding on to the ball by removing the adverse stimulus of being yelled at by your hard-ass coach. Okay? So, depending on the scenario, it could be negative reinforcement, but on the surface, to keep things less complicated, it's an example of punishment. Positive punishment. Decreasing fumbling by adding being yelled at. Let's see, what type of operant conditioning is this? Taking Pepto-Bismol because you have an upset stomach. Okay, adverse stimulus. Feeling nauseous, having diarrhea, whatever the case may be. In order to remove the adverse stimulus of having an upset stomach, you are more likely to increase the behavior of taking medicine, especially if you feel that it's effective. If you have a really bad stomach ache and you take Pepto-Bismol and suddenly your stomach ache goes away, well, tomorrow or in a few hours when you have those same symptoms, you're more likely to take Pepto-Bismol again in the future. Increasing the likelihood of taking Pepto-Bismol by removing the adverse stimulus of having an upset stomach. Negative reinforcement. Putting money in a soda machine that steals your change. Negative punishment. You are less likely to put money in the soda machine again because you've lost money the last time you did it. The soda machine is punishing you. If the soda machine was wanting you to not put money in it, the soda machine would be doing a really good job. Your behavior is likely to decrease as a result of removing something that you wanted, something that was desirable, in this case your money. Again, this was the prototypical example of operant conditioning. Giving your dog a treat for sitting, positive reinforcement. The dog is more likely to sit in the future because you gave it positive reinforcement. And remember, in this instance, positive reinforcement isn't just telling your dog that he's a good dog, although that could be positive reinforcement. In this instance, the positive reinforcement is literally giving the dog a treat, adding a stimulus. Your alarm rings to stop you from sleeping too long. Okay? This is just like my negative reinforcement example. Oh. Wait a minute, positive punishment. Decrease behavior by adding a stimulus. Well, I guess this depends on what the behavior is that we're targeted. Yeah, you're punished when your alarm goes off for sleeping too long. So if you're wanting to decrease the behavior of sleeping in, yeah, you add the punishment of the alarm. That would decrease the behavior of sleeping in. But this can also be an example of negative reinforcement, just like the seatbelt signal in your car, because in order to get up and turn your alarm off, you have to remove the adverse stimulus, which is the annoying sound of your alarm. So you get up, you wake up, you get out of bed, you go turn the alarm off. Your behavior of getting up at 6 o'clock has been increased by removing the adverse stimulus. So again, it depends on what the behavior is that we're targeting. That's going to determine how we look at whether or not this is reinforcement or punishment. If the behavior that we're targeting is sleeping in too late, then yes, having an alarm is an example of punishment. If the behavior that we're targeting is getting up on time, then this would be an example of negative reinforcement. Losing your cell phone after getting caught in class, again, that would be punishment. You lose your cell phone, it's taken away, it's negative. Here's another example of one that can be looked at one of two ways. Lifting weights. Is that positive reinforcement or is it negative reinforcement? Some people might think exercise is a punishment, but for the purposes of this, we're saying that exercise is something that you're choosing to do yourself to benefit your own health. Exercise is a reinforcement. Well, is it positive or negative? Well, if you're trying to, say, build muscle, maybe demonstrated by your ability to lift more weight, then this would be an example of positive reinforcement. Because you're adding the stimulus of maybe seeing your physique change in the mirror over time, or literally adding weight to your squat rack as this woman is squatting in the animation here. So adding stimulus could be an example of positive reinforcement. But what if you're lifting weights to lose weight? Okay, well, is that positive or negative? Well, if we're losing something, it would be negative. But what is the behavior that we're trying to increase? It's still lifting weights, it's still getting exercise. So this is still an example of reinforcement. But what is reinforcing our behavior is seeing that number on that scale go down. Some people lift weights to build muscle and build mass and bulk up and gain weight. Some people exercise, including weight training, in order to burn fat and lose weight. Depends on what your goals are, okay? The way a scenario is worded can affect the answer. If you're trying to build muscle or gain weight, then that would be an example of positive reinforcement. If you're trying to lose weight, then that's negative reinforcement. Understand, again, because it's reinforcement, we're always talking about increasing the likelihood of a behavior. Positive or negative just means it's something being added that increases the likelihood of our behavior, or is something being subtracted or taken away that increases the likelihood of our behavior. When it comes to effectiveness of behavioral modification, reinforcement is more effective than punishment. Punishment is limited. It only produces a temporary effect. And there's some side effects of punishment. So punishment shouldn't be used often, but sometimes it's necessary. Sometimes there's just not time. Okay, so this was the video 2, which corresponds with assignment 1, and after this, all you have to do is go complete assignment 2, which is essentially an exit slip, which is asking you to explain in your own words the differences between negative reinforcement and punishment. So think about why those things are often confused. So you've watched video 1, you've watched video 2 and completed assignment 1, which was your guided notes, and now you have to go do assignment 2. And that's it. And I will hopefully be in touch with you all next week. Go do assignment 2. Take care.